So, should you actually be eating eggs after 60, or is avoiding them quietly working against your body? Because this is where a lot of people are still operating on outdated advice. Some still limit eggs because of cholesterol, while others eat them every day and say they feel stronger, more stable, even mentally clearer. And both sides sound reasonable. But here's what most people don't realize. Your body after 60 responds to food differently than it did years ago, and that changes how eggs affect you. The body doesn't just age, it adapts. The same foods, the same habits, the same routines start producing different results over time. If you want more clear, practical health insights like this, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Now here's where this starts to matter. After 60, one of the most important changes is something most people never notice directly. Muscle response begins to decline. Not just muscle size, the ability to respond to protein. This is well documented in aging research as anabolic resistance, meaning your muscles require a stronger signal to maintain and rebuild. So the same amount of protein you used to eat no longer produces the same effect, and that shifts everything. Because maintaining muscle is not just about strength, it directly affects balance, mobility, and long-term independence. This is where eggs become relevant in a very specific way. Eggs have one of the highest biological values among whole foods, meaning a larger portion of the protein you consume is actually converted into usable body tissue. So it's not just about eating protein, it's about how efficiently your body can use it. And this is where many people unknowingly go in the wrong direction. They increase protein intake, but not protein quality. When results don't change, it feels like nothing is working. Now this is where it shifts again. Eggs are not just protein. They carry something else your body increasingly depends on. Think about this for a moment. Have you noticed small changes in memory or focus? Not dramatic, just slower recall, slightly more effort to concentrate, because this is where another change begins to show up. Choline. Eggs are one of the richest dietary sources of choline, and choline is required to produce acetylcholine, a neurotransmitter essential for memory and cognitive function. Many adults do not consistently reach recommended choline intake levels, and this becomes more relevant with age. So when people increase egg intake and notice clearer thinking, it's not coincidence. There is a physiological reason behind it. Now here's another layer that becomes harder to ignore. Vision. After 60, the retina becomes more vulnerable to cumulative stress over time, including age-related macular changes and gradual loss of visual sharpness. This is where eggs provide something very specific. Egg yolks contain lutein and zeaxanthin, carotenoids that are concentrated in the retina. Research links higher intake of these compounds with a lower risk of age-related macular degeneration and better visual function over time. They act as a protective filter, helping reduce oxidative stress and light-related strain. So now a pattern starts to form. Muscle response declines, cognitive signaling slows, visual protection becomes more important, and eggs support all three at the same time. This is usually where the concern comes in. Cholesterol. Because eggs contain cholesterol, and for years, that was the main reason people were told to limit them. But this is where understanding has shifted. For most individuals, dietary cholesterol has a relatively modest effect on blood cholesterol levels compared to overall dietary patterns and metabolic health. In many cases, egg consumption is associated with increases in HDL, the lipoprotein often linked with protective effects. What matters more is the context. Eggs eaten within a balanced, minimally processed diet behave very differently than eggs combined with highly processed foods. So the outcome is not just about eggs, it's about the environment they're part of. Now there's another piece that becomes more important over time. Nutrient delivery. Eggs provide fat-soluble vitamins like A, D, E, and K in forms that are readily absorbed and used by the body. After 60, nutrient absorption and utilization can become less efficient, So foods that deliver nutrients in a bioavailable form become more valuable, not because you need more food, but because your body needs more usable nutrition. So when you step back and look at this clearly, this isn't about labeling eggs as good or bad. It's about understanding what your body is gradually losing over time and whether what you're eating replaces that loss. That's the real shift after 60. Not general nutrition, but targeted support. And this is where eggs start to make sense. Not as a trend, not as a preference, but as a food that aligns with how your body is changing. And once you see it that way, the question is no longer whether you should eat eggs. It becomes whether you're using them in the right way. Now, this is where most people want a clear answer. How many eggs should you actually be eating after 60? Because this is where things often go in the wrong direction. Some people avoid eggs completely, while others eat them randomly without any structure, and neither approach is giving you the full benefit. What research and clinical patterns suggest is that for most healthy adults, moderate egg consumption can fit within a balanced dietary pattern without increasing cardiovascular risk. Large observational studies have consistently shown that around 1 to 2 eggs per day is not associated with increased heart disease risk in generally healthy populations, especially when the overall diet is stable and minimally processed. But here's where the conversation shifts after 60. The goal is no longer just avoiding risk, it becomes maintaining function. That includes muscle, cognition, and metabolic stability. And this is where the amount starts to matter differently. Because of anabolic resistance, older adults often require a stronger protein signal to stimulate muscle protein synthesis. In practical terms, that usually means aiming for roughly 25 to 35 grams of high-quality protein within a meal, depending on body size and activity level. Eggs can contribute to that, but one egg alone is rarely enough to create a meaningful response. This is where many people unknowingly fall short. They treat eggs as a small addition rather than a functional component of the meal. So the question changes. It's not just whether you eat eggs, but whether you're eating enough to create an effect. For many people, that ends up being around 2 to 3 whole eggs in a meal, and for some, closer to 3 to 4, depending on their overall protein intake. That's not a strict rule, but a functional range based on how the body responds. What matters is the total protein quality and whether it reaches the threshold needed to stimulate muscle maintenance. Now here's where the benefit often gets quietly canceled out. It's not the egg itself, it's what comes with it. A typical pattern might include eggs paired with processed meats, refined bread, or sugary drinks. In that context, the metabolic response shifts. Refined carbohydrates can lead to rapid glucose increases, and regularly consuming processed meats has been associated with higher cardiovascular risk in multiple studies. So the body is no longer responding to the egg alone. It's responding to the entire pattern, and that changes the outcome. This is where many people misinterpret what's happening. They assume eggs are the issue, when in reality, it's the surrounding foods. When eggs are paired with fiber-rich vegetables, whole food carbohydrates, or unsaturated fats, the metabolic response becomes much more stable. Blood sugar rises more gradually, satiety improves, and the overall nutritional profile supports what the body needs after 60. The same egg, in a different context, produces a completely different result. Another common mistake is removing the yolk. This is often done to avoid cholesterol or fat, but it changes the nutritional value significantly. The majority of key nutrients in eggs, including choline, lutein, zeaxanthin, and fat-soluble vitamins, are concentrated in the yolk. When it's removed, you're left primarily with protein, but without many of the components that support brain function, eye health, and nutrient absorption. Egg whites can still be useful when additional protein is needed, but relying on them alone removes much of what makes eggs uniquely beneficial. Cooking method also plays a role. High heat over longer periods can reduce certain sensitive compounds, particularly carotenoids like lutein and zeaxanthin. That doesn't mean cooked eggs are a problem, but it does mean preparation matters. Methods like poaching, soft boiling, or lightly scrambling at lower heat tend to preserve more of these nutrients compared to prolonged high-temperature cooking. It's not about perfection, but about understanding that small differences in preparation can influence what your body actually receives over time. Timing is another factor that changes how effective eggs are. While many people associate eggs with breakfast, what matters more is when your body is most responsive to protein intake. After longer periods without food, such as overnight, the body tends to respond more strongly to protein. That's one reason eggs are commonly used, in the first meal of the day, but they can be just as effective later, especially if earlier meals were low in protein. So again, it's not about tradition, it's about function. When you step back and look at the full picture, the outcome is shaped by multiple factors at the same time. How many eggs you eat, what you eat them with, how you prepare them, and when you consume them all influence the result. This is why two people can both say they eat eggs and still experience completely different outcomes. Eggs themselves are not a complete solution. They are a high-quality input, and like any input, their effectiveness depends on how they are used within the overall system. So the question is no longer simply how many eggs you should eat. It becomes whether you're using them in a way that actually supports what your body needs now. Now, this is the part most people are still unsure about, even after everything we've covered. Cholesterol. Because no matter how much new information comes out, this concern doesn't fully go away. And that hesitation is understandable. For years, eggs were directly linked to rising cholesterol and heart disease risk. So even now, many people limit them not because of what they feel, but because of what they've been told. But this is where the understanding has shifted, and it's important to be precise. When you eat cholesterol from foods like eggs, your body doesn't simply add that amount directly into your bloodstream. The body regulates cholesterol through a balance of production and absorption. In many individuals, when dietary cholesterol increases, the body compensates by reducing its own production. This regulatory process has been demonstrated in metabolic studies, and it helps explain why the response to dietary cholesterol varies from person to person. This is where the conversation becomes more specific. In most healthy individuals, moderate egg consumption has a relatively small impact on LDL cholesterol compared to other dietary factors such as refined carbohydrates, trans fats, and overall dietary patterns. Some studies have also shown that egg consumption can increase HDL levels, which are involved in reverse cholesterol transport, a process that helps move cholesterol away from the arteries and back to the liver. But this is where it's important not to oversimplify. Not everyone responds the same way. Some individuals, often referred to as hyperresponders, may experience a larger increase in LDL when consuming higher amounts of dietary cholesterol. Even in those cases, HDL often rises as well, and the balance between these markers becomes more important than a single number alone. This becomes even more relevant after 60, because the body's response to food becomes more dependent on the overall metabolic environment. That means the effect of eggs is influenced more by what surrounds them than by the egg itself. A diet high in refined carbohydrates and low in fiber tends to promote less favorable lipid patterns and greater metabolic stress, while a diet built around whole foods, fiber, and unsaturated fats supports more stable lipid balance. So when people say eggs are either good or bad for cholesterol, they're often missing the context that actually determines the outcome. Another factor that needs to be considered is inflammation. Cardiovascular risk is not determined by cholesterol alone. Chronic low-grade inflammation plays a central role in the development of plaque within the arteries. Eggs, when consumed as part of a balanced diet, do not appear to increase inflammatory markers in most individuals. However, when combined with highly processed foods and poor metabolic control, the overall inflammatory environment can shift. So again, the pattern matters more than the individual food. This leads to a more practical question. Who should be more cautious with egg intake? Individuals with certain conditions, such as poorly controlled diabetes or specific lipid disorders, may require a more individualized approach. Some studies have observed different responses in these populations, but it is often difficult to separate the effect of eggs from the broader dietary and metabolic context. This is why a personalized approach becomes more important in these cases rather than a general restriction for everyone. Now, here is where a different type of mistake happens. People reduce or eliminate eggs out of caution, but they do not replace the nutrients that eggs were providing. Protein intake decreases. Choline intake becomes less consistent. Fat-soluble vitamin intake is reduced. And over time, these changes do not always show up immediately in lab results, but they can affect how the body functions day to day. After 60, the goal is not just to manage numbers, it is to maintain function, including strength, stability, cognitive clarity, and visual performance. When you step back and look at the full picture, eggs provide a combination of nutrients that align with several of these needs. They support muscle maintenance through high-quality protein, cognitive function through choline, and visual health through carotenoids. They also deliver fat-soluble nutrients in forms that are efficiently used by the body. When they are removed without a clear replacement strategy, the loss is not always obvious at first, but over time it can influence how the body performs. So the question is no longer whether eggs raise cholesterol in isolation. The more relevant question is how eggs fit into your overall metabolic environment, because that environment determines whether your body moves toward stability or toward imbalance. And once that becomes clear, the fear around eggs tends to shift, not because eggs are perfect, but because they are no longer being evaluated without context. At this point, the question becomes much more practical. If eggs can support muscle, brain, and eye function after 60, then what's the best way to actually use them so you feel the difference? Because this is where most people either get results or miss them completely. The first shift is how you structure the meal around them. Eggs work best when they're not isolated. When they're combined with fiber-rich vegetables or whole food carbohydrates, the body's response becomes more stable. Blood sugar rises more gradually, insulin response stays more controlled, and satiety improves. This matters more after 60 because the body becomes less efficient at handling rapid spikes in glucose. A simple example is eggs with sautéed vegetables, leafy greens, or legumes, rather than pairing them with refined bread or sugary drinks. The egg itself hasn't changed, but the environment you place it in determines how your body responds. The next factor is consistency. After 60, the body responds more to patterns than to single meals. Eating eggs occasionally will not produce the same effect as incorporating them regularly into a balanced routine. This doesn't mean eating them excessively, but using them as a consistent source of high-quality protein and nutrients across the week. The body adapts to repeated signals, and when that signal is stable, outcomes tend to be more predictable. Preparation also plays a role, but it doesn't need to be complicated. Moderate cooking methods tend to preserve more of the nutrients that are sensitive to prolonged heat. Soft boiling, poaching, or gently scrambling eggs at lower temperatures helps retain compounds like lutein and zeaxanthin more effectively than extended high-heat cooking. At the same time, cooking improves protein digestibility, so the goal is balance rather than perfection. Small adjustments in how you prepare eggs can influence what your body receives over time. Another detail that often gets overlooked is how eggs fit into total daily protein intake. Eggs can be a strong foundation, but they may not cover the full requirement on their own. Combining eggs with other protein sources such as fish, legumes, or dairy can help ensure that overall intake supports muscle maintenance. This becomes increasingly important as the body's protein needs shift with age. There is also the question of timing. While eggs are commonly associated with breakfast, their value is not limited to a specific time of day. What matters more is when your body benefits most from a protein intake that it can use effectively. After longer periods without food, such as overnight, the body tends to respond more strongly to protein, which is one reason eggs are often used in the first meal. However, they can be just as effective later in the day if earlier meals were low in protein. The focus is not tradition, but response. Hydration and overall dietary balance also influence how well nutrients are utilized. Even high-quality foods do not function in isolation. Adequate fluid intake, sufficient fiber, and balanced micronutrient intake all support how the body processes what you eat. Eggs contribute to that system, but they rely on the system functioning well. When you step back and look at all of this together, the outcome is not driven by one decision. It's shaped by a series of small, consistent choices: how you combine foods, how often you use them, how you prepare them, and how they fit into your overall routine all determine the result. This is why two people can follow a similar diet on the surface and still experience very different outcomes. So at this stage, it's no longer about asking whether eggs are beneficial. It's about whether you are using them in a way that aligns with what your body needs now. Because after 60, the difference is rarely in the food itself. It's in how that food is applied. By now, the question isn't whether eggs can fit into your diet after 60. It's whether you're using them in a way that actually supports how your body is changing. Because this is where everything we've covered starts to come together in a very practical way. After 60, the body doesn't respond well to extremes. It responds to consistency, balance, and how well your daily habits align with its current needs. Eggs can be part of that alignment, but only when they are used with awareness. That means paying attention not just to the food itself, but to how it fits into your overall routine. When eggs are used as a consistent source of high-quality protein, paired with fiber-rich foods, and prepared in a way that preserves their nutrient value, they contribute to a system that supports stability rather than fluctuation. This is where the long-term effect begins to show. Muscle maintenance becomes more reliable. Energy levels feel more steady throughout the day. Cognitive clarity remains more consistent. Vision changes may progress more slowly. None of these shifts happen all at once, and they are not always dramatic in the moment. But over time, they reflect how well the body is being supported on a daily basis. At the same time, it's important to recognize that eggs are not a complete solution. They do not replace the need for overall dietary balance, physical activity, or proper medical care when needed. What they provide is a concentrated source of nutrients that align with several of the body's key systems. When that is combined with consistent movement, adequate hydration, and a balanced dietary pattern, the overall effect becomes more meaningful. This is also where individual variation matters. Some people may feel a noticeable difference when increasing egg intake, while others may not perceive a change as clearly. That does not mean the effect is absent. It often reflects differences in baseline nutrition, metabolic health, and overall lifestyle. Paying attention to how your body responds over time provides more useful feedback than relying on a single expectation. When you look at this from a broader perspective, the role of eggs becomes clearer. They are not a trend or a shortcut. They are a practical, accessible food that can support multiple aspects of health when used correctly. The value is not in the egg alone, but in how it fits into a pattern that supports long-term function. So instead of asking whether eggs are good or bad, the more useful question becomes whether your daily habits are supporting what your body needs now. Because after 60, the difference is rarely about one food. It is about how consistently your routine supports strength, stability, and overall function. And once that perspective shifts, decisions about what to eat become less about restriction and more about alignment. We are building toward 10,000 subscribers, and every single one counts. I'll see you in the next one.